Are there any similarities between electronics recycling and IT asset disposition on the one hand, and electric vehicle or EV battery recycling? Of course, electronic recyclers and ITAD companies deal with a lot of batteries when refurbishing and disassembling laptops and other devices, and EV battery recycling can be part of this broad e-waste sector. But EV battery recycling is a different beast. It has a different set of players, different set of rules. EV batteries do not store information. Even the composition of its workforce is different than in ITAD. And so because I did not know much about the sector, I had the pleasure to discuss it with my friend Lauren Roman. I have known Lauren for many years. She is the founder and the principal consultant for Transparent Planet, established in 2012, essentially to promote sustainability and transparency in the electronics industry, with a current focus on EV and energy storage batteries. Now, during her 30 years of combined experience in electronics and battery lifecycle management, Lauren has held executive positions including business director and vice president of marketing for various organizations in the field. She currently chairs the Track and Trace Committee for the Alliance of Advanced Transportation Batteries, and serves also as the vice chair of the Battery Global Traceability Standards Committee for the Society of Automotive Engineers, or SAE. Lauren is a technical person with skills extending to such things as auto ID technologies to track and trace, and she has led 2 teams to success in 3 rounds of the Department of Energy's lithium-ion battery recycling prize competition. So naturally, I started our discussion by questioning her on how she pivoted from electronic waste to EV battery.
So the way that I transitioned, and that's really not the right word because I'm still involved in both, but transitioned from spending all of my time in electronics lifecycle management, electronics recycling, IT asset management, and all that to batteries was, you know that I started back, on the electronic side, like in the early 90s, and quickly started learning about all the trouble with exporting electronic waste. And then I was very much involved in the R2 standard development process, and then also in the e-stewards process, and actually went on to kick off the e-stewards program with the Basel Action Network as the e-stewards business director, which I was for a couple of years to get that program up and running. So that was a big step forward with electronics and ITAD, but it wasn't enough. And so I very frustrated that, organizations like BAN were still catching companies exporting in violation of their standard and all that. And I thought, the only way that we're really going to solve this problem is to really start tracking material. And so I started studying up on RFID and other types of auto ID that you can use to track materials, and got really interested in that. And then had an opportunity to do a project for actually a automotive recycler, a scrap recycler, a big one that processes for smaller companies and for smaller scrap companies. And they started getting calls about what's going on. We're getting electric vehicle batteries. Can you take these? We don't know what to do with these. And so they said, I had done work for them in the past because I had helped them set up an electronics recycling operation as part of their scrap operation. And so they called me and they said, can you help us with this? Of course, I said yes. And I started doing a lot of investigation and found out that this whole thing just was starting to percolate. So this is like 7 years ago, a little over 6 years ago. And anyway, that finally led to, then I was involved in the tracking side of things. And I wound up working with a company that was headquartered in London, had offices around the world, that was building a traceability platform on blockchain to trace the supply chain, what goes into batteries, where it comes from, what the carbon footprint is, to ensure that human rights violations are not occurring at the mines that material is coming from, and so on and so forth. And then actually being able to track the battery and the critical materials through the life cycle and onto responsible end-of-life recycling or recovery or reuse.
So, going back to my earlier question to you, is battery, is battery recycling considered the domain of ITAD, or could it be part of ITAD? I mean, I've seen specialized companies or companies that specialize in battery recycling, not sort of ITAD companies that are doing it. I haven't seen that infrastructure that allow battery recycling in ITAD facilities today.
Well, battery recycling has always been a part of ITAD, and
Okay.
at the level where if you want to refurbish and reuse equipment, quite often you may need to replace a battery or test the battery, which means that you're going to have battery scrap to deal with. So you're going to have a downstream provider that does the actual processing of the battery materials. I don't know of any ITAD company or electronics recycler, for that matter, that actually has an in-house material recovery process for batteries.
When you talk about EV batteries, you're talking about a completely different market. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I've been contacted by some of actually, one of them is a kind of a current client. I just do work for them off and on. And they are looking at getting into battery recycling. They're currently processing, their main thing is CRT glass, which of course is on the downslide now in terms of volume. And but they've been doing ITAD and recycling for 20 years or more, 25 years, 30 years. And so they're looking, at the long term of their business and thinking, this is connected with what we're doing. And what I suggested is, to start by doing more like a collection and a discharge and a shipping offsite to somebody who's actually doing the material recovery, because the investment that you need to do the actual processing, whether it's hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical, that's a massive, massive investment. So by, just getting into you've got a battery, I can help you with it. We'll bring it in here. Our people are trained. We're going to discharge it. We're going to package it properly, and we're going to ship it to a recycler and give you all the documentation. They haven't kicked that off yet, but it was interesting to me that, somebody that's been involved in strictly really in electronics recycling for so many years is looking at EV batteries now.
Yeah, that's look, I mean, it's got to be a very interesting market, but is it a market that large enough right now to stimulate sort of investments and justify big investments? I don't know how many EV cars that I see out there, but I don't think they are sort of mass market yet. Maybe I'm wrong.
Right. No, I mean, certainly the uptick is great. And the slowdown that you may have heard a lot about in the news recently is really not very significant. However, the battery recyclers that were around when I started in this a little over 6 years ago are much bigger company. The ones that have stuck around are much, much bigger companies. They've been, bought this one, bought that one, and now getting a lot of money from the federal government to expand those operations. So the ones that were here first have expanded dramatically and consolidated, and the new ones, there's a lot of new ones, and some of them have gotten a tremendous amount of investment, both private and from the federal government. And some, one of them that was a rising star had a significant crash in the past year, but they seem to be kind of pulling themselves together from that. But it's getting more difficult to get investment to start up a full-blown battery recycling operation. And right now in North America, in the United States, we have no hydrometallurgical process, which is recovery by water and chemicals rather than by fire, which is pyrometallurgical, which is basically smelters and so forth. So we have no hydrometallurgical, which is preferable. And the closest pyro is, I believe, is in Canada.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a much probably bigger industrial process than the ITAD. So, I mean, for those who are listening to this and don't really know the ITAD sector, which stands for ITS at disposition, just think of there are three venues when you think about those laptops that you retire or desktops. One is basically the desired outcome coming out of a first life cycle is basically finding a secondary market. So ITAD companies that are involved in that market would take that laptop, desktop, whatever other system, fix it, refurbish it, preferably do as minimum as possible, because that, the more you do, the more the cost increase. And so that's the first venue, is putting it into a secondary market. And there's a pretty pretty active market out there that would take these products that come out of lease, etc., 3-4 years later, 5 years later even. The second is really the demanufacturing process, which is sort of opening those devices, taking the various parts, the components, and putting those parts and components into also a different market, a component market, the warranty market, etc. And the third venue, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Lauren, is essentially you completely recycle that product. You destroy it, you turn it into commodities, you extract copper, gold, whatever, and you send those products into a market that would basically recycle them for whatever purpose. And then there is a fourth one, which is something that no one advocates. It's trashing the stuff. And hopefully less and less people, less and less companies do that, but it is still there based on what the UN has been reporting. Now, that process must be very different in the EV battery world, Lauren. Just if you can explain to us, once that battery is removed from the car, where does that go? I'm assuming there are channels that sort of get that product or that battery and then put it into a processing facility. But what happened at that point, and what's that channel look like?
Well, what it looks like now, and what it might look like, a few years from now, depending upon what country you're talking about, is going to be very different scene. In Europe, for example, they are implementing a European battery regulation, and it's extremely comprehensive. And it requires that the OEMs track everything that goes into their batteries, that they have what's called a battery passport, which is essentially a QR code that gets minted on the battery when the battery is created. And anybody that engages that QR code with you can use your cell phone to get the data, the information. Can get a tremendous amount of information about that battery to maximize the responsible management and to facilitate a circular economy for that battery. So that's huge. That's absolutely huge. That will be in full force in 2027. Right now, they've identified 107 data points that have to be shared with 7 different I think it's 4 or 5 different categories of people that might engage. So there's regulators, there's the general public, they would have access to certain information. And then there's something they call interested parties, which might be like a garage or a scrapyard or something like that, where they could scan that and find out what the chemistry of the battery is, who the manufacturer is, what the state of health and state of charge is, and just all kinds of information about that battery to support the repair the removal, the replacement, and the recycling ultimately of that battery. So, right, just in April, two representatives in the United States proposed a bill. It's HR 8187. And that is to require traceability on batteries sold in the United States, supply chain traceability of the critical minerals that go into the battery. So I'm getting a little away from your question, but right now, basically what happens is we don't really know, but essentially, if somebody pulls into, most people are going to have to bring their car to a dealership at this point, because
That's right.
independent garages aren't all set up to handle electric vehicles. So if you went back to the dealership and they have to replace a module, which is part of the battery, or they have to replace the entire battery, then that dealership will, work with the OEM to get that battery into a channel where it can be tested to see if it can be repurposed for energy storage, or if there's modules that are good that can be reused, or if it needs to go to one of those hydro or pyro processes that I mentioned earlier. So that would be an example, but you also have these vehicles that wind up in scrap yards. And not all the scrap yards are, have the equipment to understand what the state of health of that battery is, and whether it's safe to touch, whether it's safe to take out and store until they get somebody to recycle it, where they're going to recycle it, who they're going to give it to. I mean, there are some people that collect these batteries and take the parts out to make home energy storage units or RV energy storage units. And they're not following any like UL standard that, that's going to ensure the safety of that. So, things can still go major sideways, which we know happens when things need to be disposed of.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I would think that given that those batteries may not be that cheap, that it's easier to build a recovery infrastructure than on the than the regular ITS set recycling world, right?
Well, depending upon the chemistry, some have residual value and some don't. And the biggest expense is transportation. So it's probably going to cost you, to ship one battery, it could cost $500 to $1,000. If you have a truckload, it would be less than that, because you can put a good number of them in a tractor trailer, as long as they're all in good shape. If you have what's called a DDR battery, or defective, damaged, or recalled battery, it requires packaging that costs well over $1,000. So, and you can only, instead of being able to fill the truck up with those, you can only put one layer in a truck. So you can only put like 10 pallets, 10 batteries on a pallet in an entire tractor trailer load. So now you're talking thousands of dollars, and that we're not even to the recycling part yet.
Yeah.
So yeah. So the recycling can cost, a charge per pound, just like electronics. Or there could be, some residual value depending upon the minerals that battery is made from and what the value of those minerals are.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I was under the impression it's just a matter of getting that stuff back into a facility and charge it, and it's ready to go back to the market. But it's not as simple
That's
as
best
that.
case scenario. That happens. So, a battery can be refurbished to be used in, let's say, an older car. Let's say the battery can only now, let's say when you bought the car, the battery could go 200 miles. And now the battery can only go 80 miles. Well, for a lot of people, just tooling around town and getting their chores done and stuff, that's more than enough.
That's
So
right.
there's value, there's reuse value in that battery. There's also a significant reuse value in what we call repurposing, which is when it's used to build an energy storage unit, because you don't need as much power to do that as you do to power an automobile.
Mm.
So those are best case scenarios.
I mean, and right now, I'm assuming that every automaker is actually making, electrical vehicles. So it's,
Yeah, pretty
it's
much.
it's not as widespread as sort of your standard car, but it's everywhere, right?
Exactly. And the number of models that they're coming out with is just increasing.
Yep.
Um, yeah, absolutely.
And the Chinese are probably making X amount more for the world market, particularly for emerging markets and other places, other economies. And so it's big, but there are huge barriers of entry if you want to be in the business, right? I mean, typically, if you look at the ITAD space, for example, they say that the barriers of entry are not that really high, and they call it at some point two guys in a truck. This is not something you could do. I mean, it really requires industrial muscle and financial muscle to be in
Yeah, I
that
mean,
business.
just the sheer size of an electric vehicle battery. If anybody's listening that is not sure how big they are, it's basically the entire bottom of the car.
Wow, I'm not aware. I'm not aware of that. Yeah,
Yeah,
wow.
it's basically the whole bottom of the car. And they are getting a little bit smaller, but we're talking a big piece of equipment. Electric vehicles have way fewer parts than combustion engine vehicles, but the battery is massive. And as I said, there can be value, or it could be negative. Now, in the lead acid battery world, we that is like a perfect recycling scenario,
Hmm.
because there's value. The system is set up to collect them. There's an incentive for people to bring them back. There's an incentive for the stores to take them. And the recycling rate on lead acid batteries is like in the well into the 90s. So, and so that would be perfect scenario. But when you have a battery that's, this big versus a
Yeah,
battery
yeah.
that's the size of your car, basically, then, collection and logistics get really expensive. And as I said, if the mineral value in there isn't very high, then it's going to cost more to process it than it's going to be, then you can get paid for recycling.
Yes. So when you talk about mineral value, I'm assuming that that particular battery has no secondary lifespan, right? So this is a product that basically you take the minerals out of it and then basically you put it back into the commodity market. Is that
Mhm.
how I should interpret that?
Exactly. So yeah, so the US has almost no resources, natural resource. We have some, we have lithium resources that, a lot of people would like to see turned into lithium mines. And of course, opening a new mine these days is not the easiest thing to do. It's a big impact on the environment. You have indigenous communities that are involved, and other communities as well. And so, opening a mine is a big deal.
Hmm.
So right now, the majority of the resources are in other parts of South America, or let's see. Um, I just drew a blank on Australia, and
Yes.
of course
Canada,
China.
probably
Yeah,
Canada too. Yeah.
yeah. They have more resources than we do, but it's basically right now, the most popular chemistries involve lithium and cobalt and graphite and nickel,
A lot of
and
that in Africa too.
yes, yeah, absolutely. And there are huge problems with getting it from Africa, because a lot of it comes from conflict mines, and
Yeah.
you have human rights issues and child labor issues, and So, the OEMs have to be really, really careful about where their battery critical minerals come from.
Yeah.
And the US, the IRA bill in the US, which includes the clean car rebate that you can get at the dealership if you buy an electric vehicle, requires that the manufacturers know where their battery minerals come from, and they can only come from U.S. U.S. domestic U.S. or U.S.
Yeah.
trading partners.
Yes.
They are expanding on that a little bit, but and they've loosened it up for a little while because it took the world of electric vehicles that are available now in the United States and shrunk it down to so few that you could get this $7,500 rebate for, which is, let's face it, it's a significant help when you're trying to buy an expensive electric vehicle.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to test your mechanical skills, Lauren,
Oh
if you
boy.
don't mind. When you have sort of a standard car, you buy a brand new one. Well, you have the manufacturers, the car company's warranty, the dealership warranty. You're good for 5 years, 6 years, maybe. Or how does that work in the EV world? Because I mean, are owners of a Tesla, for example, expected to change to replace a battery, or is it not that drastic?
Well, a homeowner is not going to change their electric vehicle battery. Now, there are technologies for swapping out batteries so that rather than, say, for example, going to a Tesla charger or another charger and sitting there for an hour or two or however long it takes to charge your battery, you could go into a place where they have a unit that they can have the battery drop out of the bottom of the car, take it out, put a new battery in, bing, bam, boom, you're good to go. But that has, I mean, it's pretty expensive. So it hasn't taken off in the US. I think it's taken off more in like China and maybe India. But not yet in the US, and I don't know if it'll come to the US. Now, we do use it in the US on, say, for example, electric buses. And these batteries are often on top of the bus, and they can pull into the, lot where they go for, instead of refueling, and go under a unit that will take that battery off and put a battery on so that they can get on their way and do what they need to do.
Brilliant, brilliant. Wow.
Yeah.
But for a consumer who owns the neighbor who owns Tesla, he shouldn't be worried about that as long as he has a warranty for the next 5 years.
The warranties are usually good for like 10 years or 100,000 miles. So it's much longer than, and there are conditions. I mean, you can't, there's, quick charging and quick discharging of the battery is really bad for the battery. And they can, have evidence of that happening from the computer in the vehicle that, has some historical data about what's going on with that battery. So, you can't, you have to make sure that you take care of your battery, just like you would take care of your car, which is not a big deal. But if you abuse your battery and you violate the warranty, just like with your regular ICE vehicle, you're not going to get the new part to replace the one that you damaged.
Yeah, you talked about buses earlier. What's your sense as to what's the split between consumer and commercial? By commercial, I'm adding trucks. I'm assuming there's a lot of trucks out there that are running on electrical battery or on batteries. Where does the market stand from your perspective in the US, and anything you can share worldwide as well?
Well, I think commercially, commercial vehicles like vans and fleets, for example, the post office or UPS, or, a lot of those are starting to transition their fleets into electric. There's certainly the large, long haul vehicles. The technology is there. I don't know that I've actually noticed one on the highway yet, but they're definitely coming. And then, of course, there's also even water vehicles, boats. Transition to hybrids and electric. Here where I live in the Seattle area, we rely very heavily on the ferry system to get us where we need to go.
Absolutely.
And they are transitioning the ferry system. It's going to take a long time, and it's extremely expensive, but it's very important. And there are plans to do that here in the Pacific Northwest.
So Lauren, you absolutely passed the mechanical test.
I don't know how that happened.
Let's go to the environmental aspect of it. What's the narrative coming out of the EV industry about sort of EV being a more environmental friendly sort of a battery replacement to the fossil fuel industry? At the end of the day, if it's electricity, you're going to need a source for that electricity, whether it's natural gas or some other source. But is there a convincing argument that EV technology is a healthy and good replacement to fossil fuel?
Absolutely. So, there have been some naysayers, usually coming out of the oil and gas industry for obvious reasons, that say that, EVs are dirtier than internal combustion engines or ICE vehicles. And the data is, we have the data now. Yes, it costs, it takes a lot of resources, and it produces significant amount of carbon to produce an electric vehicle, just like it does an ICE vehicle. It could potentially, let's say, even be higher. But then when you look at the life cycle of that vehicle, the lifetime of that vehicle, that's where you have the huge savings in CO2. So it is a fact that the electric vehicles are a cleaner alternative to ICE vehicles.
Good. And you've talked about Europe as being sort of the early deployer of regulations, whether it makes sense or not. This is sort of not my position to display, but do you think the US will follow that track, or are we in an environment where, again, as we see in e-waste, states are going to have to sort of manage all of that individually?
You really struck a raw nerve with me on that one.
Sorry about that. I know it's not early in the morning.
So, we have this bill. It's going to take a lot of work to get it to go through, and that really is focused. That bill is, the purpose of it is to enable the Department of Energy to produce what's called a digital identity.
And by bill, I'm sorry, you mean in Congress? This is a federal bill.
Yes, okay. It's HR. It's called the Trace Act, Critical Minerals Trace Act, all capitals TRACE. And I already forget what that stands for, but I'm sure the CE is clean energy. And it's to give the Department of Energy, to fund the Department of Energy so that they can create the standard, basically, and not the infrastructure, but the standard for how critical minerals that go into electric vehicle batteries need to be traced. So, you asked me, or you mentioned before, actually, that Africa is one of the big places where we have critical battery mineral resources. And I also talked about the concerns with that, with those minerals coming from Africa, and how we have to be really careful about the mines that we supply our batteries with. And so that's what the federal government wants to do, but they also want to be able to trace those minerals and be able to keep those minerals in the United States and make sure that they get processed domestically so that we have more resources here in the United States to create new batteries.
The way you started sort of discussion, you were hesitant to say, yes, great, this is a great period, we're going to do it. You probably see a lot of resistance out there for any
Well,
legislation.
it's really interesting because, when I really started in this about 6 years ago, there was, I work with industry associations, and there were certain representatives from the OEM community that were scared to death of the idea of tracking anything that they were doing.
Yeah.
But that has changed so much. First of all, there are a lot of benefits to traceability. I talk about the scarcity of battery critical minerals. Well, if you're a manufacturer and you want to be able to compete and you want to make sure that you can get batteries for your cars, maybe tracking where those batteries are and what happens to them isn't such a bad idea.
Yeah.
Because Europe has jumped ahead, and any manufacturer that wants to put a vehicle on the market, an electric vehicle on the market in Europe, has to comply with the EU battery regulation. So they're ramping up to do this now, and they are seeing the potential benefits of doing this. So I just had a meeting. I am vice chair of the SAE Battery Global Standards Development Committee. And that's what we're trying to do, is to work with DOE and other organizations to build these standards for traceability for globally. And there was a representative from one of the leading OEMs in the United States, and somebody else in the meeting had said, well, maybe we should just focus on the cell and the battery cell and not, other battery materials, because that could just be more complicated. And, we don't want to do too much in the United States. So, and this person said, I don't agree with that. She said, we are completely ramping up we have to comply in Europe. So, and these are our vehicles. So why wouldn't we do it in the United States? So that is a big, and incidentally, those two people, the one that I mentioned first that was giving big pushback, to this person that was talking last week, both come from the same company.
Interesting. So the debate is still raging. I mean, there's no there's no sort of consensus yet.
There's no consensus, but Dave, I wouldn't say it's raging. I mean,
okay,
going through like standards development for electronics was pretty much excruciating.
Yes,
and agreeing to what should and shall be done, and so on and so forth. But there's much more. I don't know. There's much more energy, excitement, hopefulness. Looking into the future, knowing that this is something that we need to do. I wouldn't call it, it's not as full of friction, I don't think. I may be eating my words in a year or two, but
so the responsibility typically falls on everyone's hands. I mean, the consumer, the producer, but generally my sense when I look at IT equipment in particular, given some of these producer responsibility laws, but also logically, right? You are an OEM, you're producing the stuff, you design it in a way that it's either environmentally friendly or not, easy to repair or not. Ultimately, the buck stops at the OEM in terms of the usability of that product going forward and its recyclability and repairability, etc. In the in the EV world, you have two players that to me actually are very critical. One is the automaker, obviously, the vehicle maker, and obviously the guy that produces those batteries. Are they both equally, you think, engaged, interested? I'm assuming also, and correct me if I'm wrong, most of those batteries are manufactured in China, which is another sort of layer of complexity that uh, one would have to go through to solve this global problem of EV battery recycling. Uh, but again, a vehicle maker and the battery maker, those are the most sort of important players in this discussion.
Yes, they are. And the battery manufacturers have been a little slower to, I would say, open their doors as far as, I think it's because it's taking time for them to even understand their supply chains completely. But the pressure pushes upstream. So if the OEMs know, for example, that their consumers in the United States are not going to be able to get a $7,500 credit for buying their car because the battery comes from China, for example, or from another country that we don't do trade with, then they need to find other sources. And when they find these other sources, the battery manufacturers, they need those they have to require those battery manufacturers to show that they have transparency on their supply chain and that they know what goes in there, because the European battery regulation requires it. It has to be, those data points have to be included in that QR code, what they call the battery passport, so that, a regulator, a buyer, a garage, an auction house, a scrap recycler can scan that with their phone, get onto a website and find out the information that they need to know about that.
Yeah, and trying to do that in the US is going to be very interesting. I'm saying that because if the Japanese are capable of tracking their Wagyu beef with barcodes and QR codes, it shouldn't be that hard to do it on the
It's
on a
completely doable. It's completely
exactly.
doable. Like everything, it adds some cost. Now, the reason why the European Commission selected a QR code and not, say, for example, RFID or other auto ID technology is because anybody that has a cell phone can read a
Exactly.
QR code. And they need, it needs to be accessible to people that don't have, excuse me, RFID readers or other equipment that's required for other types of auto ID.
Yeah, it's a much cheaper alternative for sure. Much cheaper alternative, very safe, if you do it the right way for sure.
In Europe, batteries are just the beginning. They're calling it now. It started out as a battery passport. Now they're calling them digital product passports. And the next things to be regulated are textiles and apparel and electronics.
Wow.
And so consumer electronics. And then after that, they're looking at construction materials. Let's see, construction. And then there's like 25 other products that are in the pipeline. They want to create a circular economy for everything. They want to say, we have to stop throwing our resources away. And we, as human beings and the environment and manufacturers that, take these resources, what the wording is, we need to go away from a, take, make, dispose world to a take, make, reuse, remake, so that we can just eliminate waste completely. And I know that sounds like nirvana, and it kind of is right now, but it is doable. And these product passports are going to be, the first major step in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm totally in favor of tracking everything. I'm just curious, how would they track textiles? Where would they embed the QR code?
So you can put a QR code in a label.
Okay.
Just in the label on a shirt, for example.
Yeah.
And actually, you can even embed Yeah, there's technology to embed RFID technology in the fabric.
Yeah. Wow.
There's, yeah,
Amazing.
there's all kinds of crazy things. But RFID is very big in retail because it helps so much with inventory management
Hmm.
and other things. So it'll probably, I would say that I'm not sure, they might need to do a QR code in addition to other auto ID
Yeah.
that they're already using
Well,
RFID.
this brings to the forefront this concept of Internet of Things, IoT.
Absolutely.
It's you can, if you're going to do that for your sneakers and your towels and your cars and your engines, uh, pretty much you'll be able to track everything. But my argument for people that say, oh, well, privacy issues. Well, if they track your credit score, if they track your credit consumption and they score you, I got no problem with them tracking my sneakers. Or at least have some, QR code that you can identify the origin of that product. So I'm totally
Right.
okay
And
with
when we
that.
say, yeah, when we say tracking, we're tracking the material, we're not tracking the people.
Exactly. Or the usage of it, or yes, exactly. Where is it
Yeah.
coming from? And it works very well for the sort of things that you've mentioned earlier, right? Those mineral products coming from Africa. It's important that we keep an eye on this, because it's a disaster what's happening in many
Hmm.
parts of Africa in terms of how local communities are struggling. People are being displaced because of those mining sites that are being created. And so it's a big problem for sure. I guess for someone who wants to be in the recycling business, in this business, this is not something you can enter uh, even with even with equity investors. It's something that the industry has to stimulate and help create. It's not just your standard ITAD operation where you have a facility somewhere, where you have a couple of trucks and you have folks that know how to do disassembly. This is a much bigger endeavor and much more expensive.
Absolutely. And, I, I was recently contacted by a entrepreneur with a tremendous engineering background and success background, who is currently trying to set up, to start up a recycling operation. And he is struggling from the investment,
Yeah.
on the investment side of things. Even though he's got phenomenal credentials, he also has a very good team of experienced people already working with him, and he's having a lot harder time than he thought he was going to have. Then on the other side, you have companies that had an OEM partner from the get-go. So, for example, Redwood Materials is in Nevada, and the founder is a former co-founder of Tesla.
Hmm.
And so they're doing all of the tests, the vast majority of the Tesla batteries. Well, when you start up like that and you want to go get investment capital, people are going to listen to you because, one of the biggest concerns are you going to have the supply to get the return on investment? And if you can prove that you have the supply from the get-go like that, then your chances of success are much, much higher.
Yeah, yeah. And your projection 5 years from now, I know there's so many moving parts, right? There's the legislative part, the regulatory environment, there's the engineering that's probably moving at a very fast pace. There's the competitive landscape between the various players in North America and Asia, etc. What's your are all of these factors uh, enabling you to see what may be coming 5 years from now, or are they clouding sort of the outlook?
Well, we have a nationwide goal of having 50% of all vehicle sales in 2030 being electric vehicles. So that's
Wow, that's a
huge.
that's a
There are
high
state,
bar.
yeah, there are states that have more aggressive goals than that,
Let me guess,
but
California?
you think? Um, but and that's really important because those are mandates, and And, there are other countries that have much more aggressive goals than that. So, and I think once they become more normal, of course, charging infrastructure is a huge barrier right now for consumers. You kind of hear both sides of the coin. You hear that it's horrible. You hear that it's not so bad. You hear whatever. It's not great right now. It's definitely not great. I would buy an electric vehicle, but that's me. And I live in the Pacific Northwest, and there's a fair amount of charging infrastructure up here.
Yeah.
But there's a tremendous amount of federal money being invested into charging infrastructure. So in 5 years, I would hope that we're on the precipice of 2030. I would hope to see half the vehicles on the road being electric vehicles or more. That people will start seeing the value of not having to spend around here. I don't know what it is by you, but we're looking at between $4.50 and over $5 a gallon for gasoline. Even if you have a mid-sized vehicle, that's a big hit every time you go to the pump. That goes away. That goes away. So
is it? I mean, you feel the price difference between gasoline and electrical charge?
Absolutely, but it's significant.
Interesting. So, Lauren, you've been, I'm always curious about the people that I talk to, and I sort of try to get them to dial back a little bit to where they started. You've been in this business in the ITAD business for sure, and now obviously in this new segment for quite a while. How did you start? What? I mean, for me, basically, it's a Jerry Powell conference, E-Scrap, that dragged me into this while I was pretty happy doing other things. But I was fascinated by the end of life and what happens there. How did you get there? How did you get in first, years ago in the ITAD or e-waste? And now, obviously, that this is a continuation.
That's a great question. So I spent about 7 years in the hazardous waste business, and got pretty tired of that, let's just say.
Yeah.
Just problems in that industry as well. But that industry is way more regulated, so it's much more organized than electronics recycling, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I left that industry in the early 90s, and I started my own business. At the time, it was called Industrial Recycling Services. And I started offering corporations non-traditional recycling services for things like commingled packaging, and they couldn't be recycled. Let's picture a Band-Aid, for example. It's got all different kinds of materials. And for some other things that were very difficult to recycle. So I could help these companies increase their recycling rates. And this was before the internet, or at the very beginning. Yep. So what I basically was a broker. But you could easily be a broker back then, because if you knew where to send the material and your customers didn't, you had a business. And that's basically what I did. And in doing that, I went to a conference I think it was in Albany, and it was an electronics recycling conference. And this was like in 1992. And a gentleman that gave a presentation from Digital Equipment Corporation. Now, people listening to this aren't even going to know who Digital is, but they were eventually bought by Compaq and eventually became part of Hewlett Packard. So they had the country's first electronics demanufacturing operation in a beautiful little town in New Hampshire called Kentucket, New Hampshire. And I went up there and I met with the guy who did the speaking. And I said, I know all these environmental managers at these corporations because I've been servicing their hazardous waste needs for years. And nobody knows that there's hazardous liability. This was before data was a thing. Yeah. Nobody knows that there's hazardous liability in their electronics. And so I would like to talk to these people and get them to ship their e-scrap to you. And so that's what I did. And one of my favorite stories is I went into a big pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, and they said, this is really interesting. We do have electronics like an empty cubicle. People would start putting their old printers in there, and they didn't have a warehouse that they were storing it in. It was just kind of here, there, and everywhere through this massive pharmaceutical operation in New Jersey. They said, we'll send out a memo, send in a truck on Friday, and we'll see what comes out of the woodwork. We shipped 13 tractor trailer loads of electronics out of that facility.
Wow.
And then they just got on a regular schedule.
Amazing.
So it was really fun. And, but that, and so that was kind of when the electronics industry started to percolate. And so I started going into electronics recyclers, many of whom came from the repair industry, and all of a sudden had this growing pile of e-scrap and didn't know what to do with it. And I worked with owners of companies in the industry to help them set up their marketing, their sales, the way they were going to talk to their customers, where they were going to send their materials. And I did that for many years for I don't know how many companies I worked with. So that's how it all started.
Just a quick question on sort of the EV market. What kind of companies do you see out there that are doing cool things? Which companies would you recommend anywhere along the EV chain that is doing something really interesting that's worth watching, tracking, following?
Oh, that's a big question.
That tells you this is not a market where there's a lot of companies, right? I mean, there's
there are and there aren't. Like I said, there's some of the larger players. I mentioned one before called Redwood, Cirba Solutions. That's CIRBA. They have a lot of existing and growing recycling infrastructure. They have facilities in Ohio and California. And I'm sure I'm missing other ones. And then on the repurposing side, for the energy storage, I think that's really interesting. That's really, the OEMs kind of are in betwixt and in between with that, because what they're concerned with is they want to make sure that if somebody's going to take parts from one of their electric vehicle batteries and use them to make an energy storage unit, that they can't be responsible to what happens to that battery or those parts in that energy storage unit.
That makes sense.
So like a transfer of title. But that's another thing that can happen with traceability and data sharing. So if you have a bill of sale that's a transfer of title, then the OEMs aren't the manufacturer anymore. Now the manufacturer is the person who's building the energy storage unit. So there's ways to solve that. And because all large enterprises globally are under pressure to reduce their carbon footprint, the difference in the CO2 output, it's a negative output for creating a battery from existing materials versus sending that battery for recycling, which again produces more carbon, but also produces minerals that have a carbon offset. So I don't know exactly what that balance is for recycling. It probably depends what type of recycling it is.
So Lauren, we did some research and we came up with a number, and this is sort of looking at the S part of ESG, the social part of ESG. We found of the 30 companies that we track, about 5-6 of them are managed by women. The percentage would be about 17%. The top 20 S&P is 0. There are no women in the top 20 companies that are in the US. And the top the 500 S&P is 8%, and globally it's reported that it's about 5% worldwide. There are women that are managing a corporation as a CEO, for example. I do see a lot more women in ITAD in the roles of in various roles, marketing, sales, management, etc. What's your sense as to where women today stand in sort of the broad electronic recycling world, or the broad recycling world? Are they making more strides than what we think we're seeing compared to other industries? Do you see more women in this sector, or a lot more could be done, or both?
Well, more can always be done.
Yeah.
But yes, from when I started out in electronics recycling, the number of women in electronics recycling is dramatically increased. And it's great to see. I mean, you go to, the eScrap conference, for example,
Exactly.
and it's a pretty good blend of people. Yes, there are more men there than women, absolutely. But on the battery side, it
Yeah.
is completely tilted. Uh, there are some women's groups now that have formed to, to support each other and so on and so forth. But it's pretty pathetic when you look at the different companies that are in the industry and the whole life cycle, whether it's the mining, whether it's the battery manufacturing, the car manufacturing, the recycling, the life cycle management, wherever it is, you click on that website to look at the management team and the boards of directors. In the management team, you might have a woman in human resources, a woman in marketing, maybe an attorney, but in terms of all
Operational
the other
stuff. Yeah.
management positions and operations and all that, they're a very, very small percentage. So of course, a lot more can be done. And, it all boils down to the education and the messaging that young people get when they're growing up. When I was growing up, I didn't know what an engineer was. I thought an engineer ran a train.
Yes.
So could I consider studying that in college? Well, I didn't want to run a train.
No.
So I didn't go into engineering. I didn't even know what it was. And even though I actually did major in environmental studies 100 years ago when I was in college, it was, even at that point, my school that I went to didn't even know what classes to put me in to get an environmental degree. So we've come a ways, certainly on the environmental side, but we've got a long way to go in terms of women's position in business.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lauren, we talked earlier about mines in Africa and Canada and Australia. You are absolutely a gold mine of information, just to say. So,
Thank you.
you have great deal of experience. You know a lot about all these sort of sectors that we've talked about. As an independent consultant, what services do you offer? I mean, if we have folks that are looking at this, listening, that might have an investment in a venture that is sort of in the same business or adjacent to it and need expertise, how can you contribute?
Well, thanks for asking that. So I do different things for different companies, but if somebody asks me what actually I do, I work a lot with companies on their business strategy.
Hmm.
And so right now I'm working with a startup that is actually more on the electronic side, and they have a process for recovering integrated circuits from circuit boards and being able to renew those for reuse. And with the carbon, with all of the electronics manufacturers and other and their customers needing to reduce their carbon, this is a great way for them to reduce the carbon footprint of the electronic products that these reusable chips go in.
Hmm.
So, I've been helping them understand, who their best prospective clients might be, how we're going to talk about this, um, getting them information that they need to satisfy their investors. And and so that's one example. But on the battery side, I've worked with track and trace companies that have the technology like the RFID, that are looking at maybe getting into the battery world because there's so much going on with traceability, and analyzing their current resources dedicated to it, what their staff that they have that's dedicated to it, what the voids are, what their needs are. So And then I'm doing some work for another company. They're headquartered in Scotland that has a device that can wirelessly share data about the batteries, which can reduce a lot of the wiring and things that cause fires, and also reduces the carbon footprint because there's fewer parts in there. So helping them develop their value propositions for this product. Their product launch will be this year. So it's really pretty broad what it is that I do. But I am largely focused. I'm focused in batteries and electronics right now because of what's going on in the battery world. I'm more focused on the battery side of things.
Yeah, and for those of you who are listening and who may need, a top expert, absolutely, Lauren is your person for that. And her contact information is below, and we will also include it at the end of the discussion. So don't hesitate. Lauren is absolutely top notch, and I've known her for years, so I can say that she is one of the best, if not the best, for sure. So, Lauren, this brings to an end our discussion. And listen, I would love to, have these discussions a little more often as the industry, the technology, etc., develop. I know there's a lot of things coming up. AI, for example, is a very curious thing that's taking place. That's going to hit us very, very hard, potentially. Hopefully not so hard, but there's going to be some interesting things taking place. And I know you're tracking all of this. And because of that, if you would be kind to come back again.
Would love to.
We would love to as well.